The saloon doors of the Silver Spur swung open with such force that several patrons turned to stare. But Willa Olsen barely noticed as she stepped into the dusty street of Trinidad, Colorado. Her heart pounding with anger and her hands still trembling from the confrontation she had just endured with her former employer. The summer evening of 1878 hung heavy with heat and the smell of horses, and she clutched her worn carpetbag tighter, every penny she owned pressed against the bottom of that threadbare fabric. She had told Mr. Hendricks exactly what she thought of his wandering hands and his assumption that a seamstress in his employ was there for more than mending shirts. And now she was jobless in a town where opportunities for respectable women were scarcer than rain in August. The sun was setting behind the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold that seemed too beautiful for how wretched she felt. Willa walked quickly down the main street, past the general store and the livery stable, trying to formulate a plan. She had enough money for perhaps 3 nights at the boarding house, maybe 4 if she skipped meals, and then she would need to find work. The problem was that Trinidad was a small town, and word traveled fast. By morning, everyone would know she had quit her position at the dress shop, and Hendricks would likely spread rumors about why. She was so lost in her worried thoughts that she did not notice the man stumbling out of the Golden Nugget saloon until he was nearly upon her. The reek of whiskey hit her before his hand did, grasping at her arm with clumsy desperation. "Well, hello there, pretty thing," he slurred, his eyes unfocused and his grip surprisingly strong despite his drunken state. "Were you heading off to all alone?" Willa tried to pull away, her stomach twisting with fear. "Let go of me." "Come on now, don't be unfriendly," he said, pulling her toward the narrow alley between the saloon and the abandoned millinery shop. "Just want to talk to you for a minute." She planted her feet, trying to wrench her arm free, but he was bigger than her and too drunk to register her protests. "I said let go." Her voice rose, but the street was emptying as people headed home for supper, and those who remained were either too far away to hear or too accustomed to ignoring trouble. The drunk man's fingers dug into her arm hard enough to bruise as he dragged her toward the shadows of the alley. Panic flooded through Willa's veins, cold and sharp despite the evening heat. She opened her mouth to scream, but before she could make a sound, a figure materialized from the darkness itself. One moment, there was only the drunk man pulling her into danger, and the next there was a wall of muscle and buckskin standing between them. The newcomer was massive, broad-shouldered and tall, with dark hair that fell past his collar and a beard that spoke of months in the wilderness. His hand closed around the drunk's wrist with the casual strength of a man who could break bones without effort. "The lady wants you to let go," the stranger said, his voice deep and calm, like distant thunder that promised a storm if you were fool enough to ignore the warning. The drunk man released Willa immediately, his whiskey-soaked brain apparently still functional enough to recognize real danger when it stood 6 feet 4 inches in front of him. "Didn't mean nothing by it," he mumbled, backing away. "Just being friendly. Be friendly somewhere else." The stranger did not raise his voice, but something in his tone made the drunk man turn and stumble back down the street without another word. Willa stood frozen, her heart still racing as the mountain man turned to face her. In the dying light, she could see his eyes were a striking pale blue, almost gray, and they studied her with an intensity that should have been frightening but somehow was not. His face was weathered and hard, the face of a man who had spent years under an unforgiving sun and knew how to survive in places that would kill softer men. His arms, bare below rolled-up sleeves, showed muscles earned through genuine hard labor and there was a quiet competence in the way he held himself that spoke of absolute confidence. "You all right, miss?" he asked. Willa realized she was staring and felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "Yes, thank you. I am fine, or I will be." She rubbed her arm where the drunk had grabbed her, knowing there would be marks tomorrow. "Let me walk you where you are heading," he said. It was not quite a question, more a statement of what was going to happen whether she agreed or not. But there was a courtesy in his tone that suggested he would respect a refusal if she gave one. She should have refused. She did not know this man, and for all she knew he could be more dangerous than the drunk had been. But something in those pale eyes told her he was not, and she was tired of being afraid. "The boarding house on 4th Street, she said. "Mrs. Campbell's place." He nodded and picked up her carpet bag, which had fallen to the ground during the struggle. "I am Pierce Northwood," he said as they began to walk. "Most folks just call me Northwood. Willa Olsen." She fell into step beside him, acutely aware of how small she felt next to his towering frame. "Are you passing through Trinidad, Mr. Northwood?" "Was planning on it," he said. "Came down from the mountains to sell some furs and stock up on supplies, but I might stay a while if there is reason to." There was something in the way he said it, a subtle emphasis on the last few words that made Willa glance up at him. He was looking straight ahead, his expression unreadable, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth quirk slightly. They walked in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing on the wooden boardwalk. Willa could feel the curious stares of people they passed, and she knew that by tomorrow the whole town would be talking about her walking with the mountain man. Let them talk, she thought with sudden defiance. It could hardly make her situation worse. "What brings you to Trinidad, Miss Olsen?" Pierce asked. "You do not sound like you are from around here." "I came from Kansas," she said. "My parents died of fever 2 years ago, and I had to sell the farm to pay their debts. I heard there was work out west for women who were willing to work hard, so I came here and found a position as a seamstress." Found or had? His perception surprised her. "Had," she admitted. "I quit today. My employer thought the position came with privileges that I was not willing to grant." Pierce's jaw tightened, and she saw his free hand curl into a fist before deliberately relaxing. Man ought to be horsewhipped. "I told him worse than that. I am afraid," Willa said, and was surprised to find herself almost smiling at the memory of Hendrix's shocked face when she had informed him that he was a lecherous toad who would die lonely and unloved. "Which is why I am currently unemployed and trying to figure out what to do next." They had reached the boarding house, a tidy 2-story building with white paint that was only slightly faded and a front porch that actually had chairs for sitting. Mrs. Campbell kept a respectable establishment, which was why Willa had chosen it despite the higher cost. Pierce set down her carpetbag and turned to face her. Up close, she could see the small scars that marked his hands and the thin white line across his cheekbone that spoke of an old wound. He was a hard man, forged by a hard life, but his eyes when he looked at her were gentle. "Thank you, Mr. Northwood," she said. "I do not know what would have happened if you had not been there." "I know what would have happened," he said quietly, "which is why I am glad I was." He hesitated, as if debating something with himself, then continued. "Miss Olsen, I know we just met, and you have no reason to trust me beyond what happened tonight. But I am staying at the hotel across the street, and if you need anything at all, you come find me. Understand?" The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something warm unfurl in Willa's chest. "I understand. Thank you." He tipped his head in farewell and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly down the street. Willa watched him go, then picked up her carpetbag and went inside. her mind full of questions about the mountain man who had appeared from the shadows like an answer to a prayer she had not known she was praying. Mrs. Campbell was in the front parlor, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on what looked like a scarf. She was a round, comfortable woman in her 50s with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Evening, Miss Olsen," she said. "I heard you had some excitement today." Of course she had. Willa set down her bag and sank into one of the worn armchairs. "I left my position at the dress shop." "About time," Mrs. Campbell said crisply. "That Hendricks is a weasel. You are better off without him, even if it means tight times ahead." "I have enough for a few more nights," Willa said. "After that, I will need to find something." "I might have an idea about that," Mrs. Campbell said, setting down her knitting. "My sister runs a restaurant down the street, and her girl just up and got married last week. She needs someone to help with the cooking and serving. Pay is not much, but it comes with meals, and Emma is a decent woman to work for." Relief washed over Willa like cool water. "That would be wonderful. Do you think she would consider me?" "I will talk to her tomorrow," Mrs. Campbell promised. "Now, who was that mountain man I saw walking you home?" Willa felt her cheeks warm again. "His name is Pierce Northwood. He helped me when a drunk man tried to pull me into an alley." Mrs. Campbell's expression darkened. "That would be Bill Tucker, I expect. He is always getting liquored up and bothering women. Someone ought to run him out of town." Then her face softened. "But Northwood, now there is a good man. Comes through once or twice a year to trade. Never causes trouble, always pays his debts. Keeps to himself mostly, but folks say he is fair in his dealings." "He seemed very kind," Willa said carefully. Mrs. Campbell gave her a knowing look. "Kind and easy on the eyes if you like the rugged type, and there is no Mrs. Northwood in case you were wondering." "I was not wondering," Willa lied, and Mrs. Campbell laughed. "Of course not, dear. Now you look exhausted. Go on up to bed, and I will make sure Emma knows to expect you tomorrow afternoon." Willa climbed the stairs to her small room under the eaves, her body aching with tiredness but her mind too active for sleep. She changed into her nightgown and lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of Trinidad settling in for the night. Somewhere a dog barked, and from the saloons came the tinny sound of piano music and rough laughter. She thought about Pierce Northwood, about the way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, about the quiet strength in his voice and the gentleness in his eyes. She thought about his weathered hands and broad shoulders, about the way he moved with the unconscious grace of someone completely at home in his own body. She thought about how small and safe she had felt walking beside him, and then felt foolish for thinking such things about a man she had just met. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, it was his face she saw behind her closed eyes, and the memory of his voice saying he would stay if there was reason to. The next morning dawned clear and hot, promising another scorching day. Willa dressed in her second-best dress, a simple blue cotton that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, and went downstairs to find Mrs. Campbell already up and making breakfast. "Emma wants to see you at 2 o'clock, the landlady announced, handing Willa a plate of eggs and toast. "The restaurant is called the Homestead, right next to the bank. You cannot miss it." "Thank you so much, Mrs. Campbell," Willa said gratefully. "I do not know what I would have done without your help." "We women have to look out for each other," Mrs. Campbell said firmly. "Lord knows the men are not always reliable about it." Willa ate her breakfast and then spent the morning washing her other dress and attempting to repair a tear in her petticoat. Her sewing skills, honed by 2 years working for Hendricks, made short work of the task, and she found herself with time to spare before her appointment with Emma. She decided to take a walk, partly to settle her nerves and partly in the hope that she might catch another glimpse of Pierce Northwood. She told herself this was foolish even as she found her feet carrying her past the hotel, where he had said he was staying. She did not see him at the hotel, but she did find him at the general store, his arms full of supplies that he was loading into saddlebags. He looked up as she approached, and his stern face broke into something that was almost a smile. "Miss Olsen," he said. "Good morning." "Good morning, Mr. Northwood." She felt suddenly shy, unsure what to say. "I wanted to thank you again for last night." "No need for thanks," he said. "Any decent man would have done the same." He secured the last of his supplies and turned to face her fully. "How are you this morning?" "Any trouble?" "No trouble at all. In fact, I have an interview this afternoon at a restaurant. Mrs. Campbell arranged it." "That is good news." He studied her for a moment, and she had the strange feeling he was seeing far more than she meant to show. "I hope it works out for you." "Are you leaving Trinidad soon?" The question came out before she could stop it, and she immediately felt foolish for asking. "Not as soon as I planned," he said, and there was something warm in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Thought I might stick around for a few days." "Make sure that Tucker fellow does not bother you again." "You do not need to do that," Willa protested, even as part of her thrilled at the thought of him staying. "Maybe not," Pierce agreed. "But I want to, if that is all right with you." How could she say it was not all right when every fiber of her being was singing yes? "I would not want to keep you from important business." "Nothing more important than making sure you are safe," he said simply. And the matter-of-fact way he said it, as if her safety was the most natural priority in the world, made something deep in Willa's chest ache with longing for things she had thought she could never have. They stood there in the morning sunshine, looking at each other, and Willa felt the world narrow down to just the two of them, to his pale blue eyes and the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, to the way her pulse quickened when he looked at her like she was something precious. "Miss Olsen." A sharp voice broke the moment, and Willa turned to see Mrs. Patterson, one of Hendrix's best customers, bearing down on them with the determined stride of a woman on a mission to meddle. "I heard the most distressing news. Is it true you left your position at the dress shop?" "It is true," Willa said, lifting her chin. "I found the working conditions unsatisfactory." "Well, I never," Mrs. Patterson huffed. "Mr. Hendrix told me you were unreliable and had romantic notions above your station. He said you tried to trap him into a compromising situation." Before Willa could respond, Pierce stepped forward, and though he did not touch Mrs. Patterson or raise his voice, something in his presence made the older woman take an involuntary step back. "Madam," he said, his tone polite but with an edge of steel, "I would think carefully before repeating gossip that damages a lady's reputation, especially when the gossip comes from a man who is known to have wandering hands and a loose relationship with the truth." Mrs. Patterson's face flushed red. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." "I am sure you do," Pierce said. "And I am sure that if you thought about it, you would remember at least 3 other women who left Hendrix's employ under similar circumstances. Might make a person wonder who is really at fault." The older woman opened and closed her mouth like a fish, then turned on her heel and marched away without another word. Willa stared at Pierce in amazement. "How did you know about the other women?" she asked. "I did not, for certain," he admitted. "But men like Hendrix do not usually change their ways. Seemed like a safe guess." He looked down at her, his expression serious. "You do not have to let people push you around, Miss Olsen. You have every right to stand up for yourself." "That is easy for you to say," Willa said. "You are a man, and a rather intimidating one at that. People think twice before crossing you." "True enough," he acknowledged. "Which is why, if you do not mind, I would like to make it known around town that you are under my protection. Might make folks think twice before spreading lies or causing you trouble." Willa's breath caught. In a town like Trinidad, being under a man's protection meant something. It meant she was off limits to other men, that anyone who bothered her would answer to Pierce Northwood. It also meant that people would assume there was something between them, whether there was or not. "That is a very generous offer," she said slowly, "but it might damage your reputation as much as help mine." He actually laughed at that, a deep rumbling sound that made her want to smile in response. "Miss Olsen, I live in the mountains alone except for my horse and whatever wildlife I can trap. I come to town twice a year to trade and then disappear again. I do not have a reputation to damage." "Even so, I could not ask you to do that." "You are not asking," he pointed out. "I am offering, and I would consider it a favor if you would accept." Before she could answer, the church bell rang out, marking the hour. Willa glanced up in surprise. "I need to go. My interview is in less than an hour, and I wanted to make myself presentable." "You look more than presentable," Pierce said, and the sincerity in his voice made her blush. "Good luck, Miss Olsen. I will be here if you need me." She hurried back to the boarding house, her mind whirling. Everything was happening so fast. Yesterday she had been employed but miserable, and now she was jobless but protected by a mountain man who looked at her like she hung the moon. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Mrs. Campbell helped her fix her hair and lent her a clean apron to wear over her dress. "You look lovely, dear," she said. "Emma will be lucky to have you." The Homestead restaurant was a cheerful place with red and white checked curtains and the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Emma Whitfield turned out to be a younger version of Mrs. Campbell, round and comfortable with the same sharp eyes that saw everything. "So you are the girl my sister told me about," she said, looking Willa up and down. "Can you cook?" "Yes, madam. My mother taught me, and I have been cooking for myself since she passed." "Can you handle difficult customers without losing your temper?" "I worked for Mr. Hendricks for 2 years without dumping soup on his head," Willa said. "So yes, I believe I can." Emma laughed. "I like you. The job is yours if you want it. 6 days a week, 7 in the morning until 6 at night, with an hour break in the afternoon. Pay is $10 a month plus meals. You can eat whatever is left over after the lunch and dinner rush. Starts tomorrow if you are willing." $10 a month was not much, but with meals included it was enough to pay for her room and have a little left over. "I am willing," Willa said. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield. Call me Emma. We are not formal here, and welcome to the homestead." Willa walked out of the restaurant feeling like she could float. She had a job, a safe place to live, and a mountain man who wanted to protect her. For the first time since her parents died, she felt like things might actually work out. She found Pierce sitting on the porch of the hotel, whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked sharp enough to split hairs. He stood when he saw her, reading the answer in her face before she spoke. "You got it," he said. "I got it," she confirmed, unable to keep the smile off her face. "I start tomorrow." "That calls for a celebration. Have dinner with me tonight." It was not really a question, but Willa found she did not mind. "I would like that." They ate at the homestead, which seemed appropriate since Willa would be working there soon. Emma raised an eyebrow when she saw them come in together, but said nothing. Merely showed them to a table by the window and brought them plates of roast chicken and potatoes that were the best thing Willa had tasted in months. Over dinner, Pierce told her about his life in the mountains, about the cabin he had built with his own hands and the streams where he trapped beaver and mink. He told her about winters so cold, the trees split from the frost, and summers when the wildflowers turned the meadows into seas of color. He told her about the silence of the high country, the kind of silence that let a man hear himself think, and about the stars at night that seemed close enough to touch. In turn, Willa told him about growing up on a farm in Kansas, about her father's laugh and her mother's songs, about the devastation of losing them both within a week of each other. She told him about selling the land that had been in her family for 3 generations and setting out west with nothing but hope and determination. She told him about the loneliness of the past 2 years, working for a man she despised in a town where she had no real friends. "You have been braver than you give yourself credit for," Pierce said when she finished. "Takes courage to start over with nothing." "I did not have much choice," Willa said. "There is always a choice," he countered. "You could have married the first man who asked, taken the easy way out. Plenty of women would have. But you chose to stand on your own feet, make your own way. That is courage." No one had ever described her struggle in such terms before, and Willa felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. They talked until the restaurant began to empty and Emma started giving them meaningful looks. Pierce walked Willa back to the boarding house, and they stood on the porch in the darkness, reluctant to say goodnight. "I have been thinking," Pierce said, "about what I said this morning about you being under my protection. The offer still stands if you want it." Willa knew she should be cautious, should think this through carefully, but her heart had already made the decision and her head was just catching up. "Yes," she said, "I want it. And thank you, Pierce." It was the first time she had used his given name, and she saw his eyes darken with pleasure. "Good," he said softly. "Then it is settled." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture so old-fashioned and courtly that it seemed at odds with his rough appearance. But it fit him somehow, this combination of wilderness and gentleness, strength and tenderness. Willa went to bed that night with the feeling of his lips on her hand and a smile on her face that would not fade. The next morning she started work at the homestead, and Emma put her to work immediately, teaching her the menu and introducing her to the regular customers. It was hard work, constant motion from dawn to dusk, but Willa found she enjoyed it. The customers were mostly decent people, miners and ranchers and townspeople, and Emma was a fair boss who did not mind if Willa took a moment to rest when things were slow. Pierce came in for lunch every day, always sitting at the same table by the window, and Willa found herself looking forward to his arrival with an anticipation that had nothing to do with professional duty, and everything to do with the way her heart lifted when she saw his face. He became a familiar sight around Trinidad over the next few weeks, and people began to accept his presence as natural. He helped at the livery stable when they were short-handed, fixed a broken wagon wheel for the blacksmith, and broke up a fight outside the Golden Nugget with the calm efficiency of a man who knew exactly how much force to use and when to use it. And true to his word, his protection of Willa became known throughout the town. When Bill Tucker made the mistake of approaching her on the street one afternoon, Pierce appeared seemingly from nowhere and suggested in a tone that brooked no argument that Tucker find somewhere else to be. The drunk man left Trinidad the next day, and no one was sorry to see him go. Mr. Hendricks tried once to spread more lies about Willa, claiming she had stolen from him before she left. Pierce paid him a visit, and whatever was said in that conversation, Hendricks emerged pale and shaking and never spoke ill of Willa again. When she asked Pierce what he had said, he just gave a small shrug and told her some men needed to be reminded that actions had consequences. As summer turned toward fall, Willa and Pierce fell into an easy routine. He came to the restaurant for meals, and on her day off, they would go for walks along the river or ride out to the foothills. Pierce borrowed a gentle mare from the livery for her, and they would spend hours exploring the countryside, talking about everything and nothing. It was on one of these rides that Pierce kissed her for the first time. They had stopped to rest by a stream, the aspens just beginning to turn gold around them, and Willa had been laughing at something he said. He had looked at her with such intensity that her laughter died, and then he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands and bent to kiss her. It was gentle and careful, as if he was afraid she might break, but there was heat underneath the tenderness that made Willa's knees weak. She kissed him back, wrapping her arms around his neck, and felt his arms come around her waist, pulling her close. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Pierce rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Willa Olsen," he said. "Have been since the moment I saw you in that alley. Wanted you to know that." Willa's heart felt too big for her chest. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I have been from the start." He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Willa lost herself in the sensation of being held by him, wanted by him, loved by him. When they finally pulled apart, the sun was starting to sink toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. "I need to tell you something," Pierce said as they rode back toward town. "About why I live up in the mountains alone." Willa waited, sensing this was important. "I was married once," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Long time ago, before I came to Colorado. Her name was Sarah, and she was pretty and sweet, and I thought we would have a good life together. But I was young and stupid, and I did not understand that she wanted things I could not give her. She wanted a house in town, society, fancy dresses. I wanted land and space and freedom. We made each other miserable, and after 3 years she left me for a banker in St. Louis. I let her go because I knew she would be happier without me." "I am sorry," Willa said softly. "I am not anymore," he said. "It taught me that marriage has to be between two people who want the same things, who can make a life together without one of them having to give up who they are. I went to the mountains after that because I needed to be somewhere I could breathe, somewhere I could be myself. And I have been happy there, Willa, truly happy." "But," she prompted, hearing the word he had not said. "But since I met you, I have been thinking that maybe there is something missing from that life after all. Maybe I have been happy because I did not know what I was missing." He looked at her, his pale eyes serious. "I am not asking you to give me an answer now. But I want you to think about whether you could be happy with a man who lives in the mountains, away from town and people and civilization. Because I cannot be anything other than what I am, Willa. I tried that once, and it nearly destroyed me." Willa thought about his cabin in the high country, about the silence and the stars and the wildflowers. She thought about her life in Trinidad, the restaurant and the boarding house and the people who were slowly becoming friends. And she realized that what she loved about Trinidad was not the town itself, but the sense of starting fresh, of building something new. And she could do that anywhere, as long as she was with someone who loved her. "I do not need town and people and civilization," she said. "I need honesty and kindness and someone who sees me for who I really am. And I think I have found that in you." Pierce reached over and took her hand, his grip warm and strong. "You have found that in me," he said. "I promise you that." The weeks that followed were the happiest Willa could remember. She continued working at the homestead, and Pierce continued staying in Trinidad, and they spent every moment they could together. He taught her to shoot, patiently correcting her stance and her aim until she could hit a tin can from 30 paces. She taught him to dance, laughing as he tried to remember the steps in the small space of Mrs. Campbell's parlor. Emma and Mrs. Campbell watched their courtship with approval, and even the townspeople seemed pleased. There was something about seeing the solitary mountain man soften in the presence of the quiet seamstress-turned-waitress that appealed to people's romantic natures. But as October arrived and the aspens turned the mountains into a riot of gold, Pierce began to grow restless. Willa could see it in the way he looked at the high peaks, in the tension in his shoulders. He needed to go back to prepare his cabin for winter, to check his trap lines and lay in supplies. "Come with me," he said one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the stars come out. "Not forever, not yet, just for a visit. I want you to see where I live, see if you can picture yourself there." Willa knew what he was really asking. He wanted to know if she could handle the isolation, the hard work, the sheer physicality of mountain life. And she wanted to know too, wanted to be certain before she committed herself to a life so different from anything she had known. "Yes," she said, "I will come with you." Emma gave her a week off, and Mrs. Campbell packed them enough food for a small army, and on a crisp morning when the sky was so blue it hurt to look at, they rode out of Trinidad heading north into the mountains. The journey took 2 days, climbing higher and higher into terrain that grew progressively wilder and more beautiful. Pierce showed her where to find fresh water, how to read the signs that animals left, how to move through the forest without making noise. At night, they camped under the stars, and he held her close against the cold, and they talked about their dreams and fears until sleep claimed them. On the afternoon of the second day, they rounded a bend in the trail, and there it was, Pierce's cabin, nestled in a meadow beside a rushing stream with mountains rising all around like guardians. It was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and windows that faced the morning sun. Behind it was a lean-to for the horses and a smokehouse and a small barn. "It is beautiful," Willa breathed, and meant it. Pierce helped her dismount, and she could see the relief in his face. He had been worried she would find it too primitive, too remote. But Willa felt something settle in her chest as she looked around, a sense of rightness that she had not expected. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a large room with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft above, and a smaller room off to the side that Pierce used for storage. The furniture was handmade but well crafted, and everywhere she looked she saw evidence of Pierce's skill and care. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books that surprised her until she remembered him mentioning how much he loved to read during the long winter nights. "It is perfect," she said, turning to him with a smile. Over the next few days, Pierce showed her his world. He took her fishing in the stream and taught her how to clean and cook the trout they caught. He showed her the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved meats, the spring where he got his water, the stand of pines where he cut firewood. He taught her to identify animal tracks and which plants were safe to eat, and how to tell if a storm was coming by the way the light changed. And Willa discovered that she loved it. She loved the silence that was not really silence at all, but filled with the sounds of wind and water and wildlife. She loved the clean smell of pine, and the way the stars at night were so bright, and numerous they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across the sky. She loved the simplicity of the life, the way each day had a clear purpose and end. Most of all, she loved watching Pierce in his element. Here in the mountains he was completely himself, moving with easy confidence, his face relaxed in a way it never quite was in town. This was where he belonged, and Willa realized she wanted to belong here too with him. On the last night before they were to return to Trinidad, they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of pink and orange. Pierce had been quiet all day, and Willa knew he was dreading going back to town, to the noise and the people and the feeling of being confined. "I do not want to leave," she said softly. He looked at her, hope and caution warring in his expression. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I love it here. I love this cabin and these mountains and this life. But most of all I love you, Pierce Northwood, and I cannot imagine my life without you in it." She took a deep breath. "I am saying yes to whatever question you have been afraid to ask." Pierce set down his blanket and dropped to one knee, taking her hands in his. "Willa Olsen, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I do not have much to offer you except this cabin and these mountains and a man who loves you more than he thought possible. But what I have is yours, all of it, forever." "Yes," Willa said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, yes, yes." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, and it felt like coming home. They rode back to Trinidad the next day to make arrangements. Willa gave Emma her notice, though she promised to help train her replacement. Mrs. Campbell cried and hugged her and declared that she had known from the start that Willa and Pierce were meant for each other. They were married by the circuit preacher 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church, with Emma and Mrs. Campbell and a handful of townspeople as witnesses. Willa wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved all these years, and Pierce wore new clothes that he was clearly uncomfortable in but tolerated for her sake. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Pierce kissed her, the small congregation erupted in applause. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, and Pierce was gentle and patient, making sure Willa's first time was filled with tenderness rather than pain. She fell asleep in his arms feeling cherished and loved and complete. The next morning they loaded up their supplies and rode out of Trinidad as husband and wife. A few people came out to wave goodbye, and Willa felt a pang of sadness at leaving the town that had become a refuge for her. But when she looked at Pierce riding beside her, his face already lightening as they left civilization behind, she knew she was making the right choice. The first winter was an adjustment. Willa had to learn how to cope with the isolation, the endless cold, the days when the snow was so deep they could not leave the cabin. But Pierce was a patient teacher, and she found that she had a natural aptitude for mountain life. She learned to make soap and candles, to tan hides and smoke meat, to bake bread in the fireplace and brew tea from pine needles when their store-bought tea ran out. And in the quiet evenings when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Pierce would read to her from his books, or they would talk for hours, or they would simply sit in comfortable silence, content to be together. Spring came late to the high country, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The meadow around their cabin exploded with wildflowers, and Willa spent hours exploring, delighting in every new discovery. She found a patch of wild strawberries and made preserves. She planted a small garden with seeds she had brought from Trinidad. She befriended a family of chipmunks that lived under the porch and spent an entire afternoon watching a mother deer teach her fawn to navigate the stream. Pierce watched her bloom in the mountain air, her face losing the pinched, worried look it had worn in Trinidad and taking on a glow of health and happiness. She grew stronger from the physical work, her arms developing muscles from chopping wood and hauling water. Her skin turned golden from the sun, and her laughter came more easily. In late summer of 1879, Willa realized she was pregnant. She told Pierce one evening after dinner, watching nervously for his reaction. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, and then pure joy before he swept her into his arms and spun her around, laughing. "We are going to have a baby," he said, setting her down carefully as if she might break. "Willa, we are going to be parents." The pregnancy was easier than Willa had feared, though she was grateful when Pierce insisted they go down to Trinidad a month before her due date so she could be near a doctor. They stayed with Mrs. Campbell, who fussed over Willa and fed her endless meals and regaled Pierce with advice about babies that left him looking slightly terrified. Their son was born on a snowy day in March of 1880, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. He had Pierce's blue eyes and Willa's dark hair, and they named him Thomas after Willa's father. Motherhood transformed Willa in ways she had not expected. She had always thought of herself as capable and strong, but holding her son in her arms brought out a fierceness she had not known she possessed. She understood now why Pierce had been so protective of her that night in the alley, understood the depth of feeling that came from wanting to keep someone safe from all harm. Pierce was a revelation as a father. His large hands were impossibly gentle with the tiny baby, and his deep voice would rumble lullabies that made Thomas settle and coo. He made a cradle from pine wood, sanding it until it was smooth as glass so there would be no splinters, and he would spend hours just watching his son sleep, wonder written across his face. They returned to the cabin when Thomas was 6 weeks old, and Willa found that far from being harder, life with a baby made their mountain home feel even more complete. She would carry Thomas in a sling while she worked, and he would sleep on a blanket in the meadow while she tended her garden. Pierce took him on gentle rides around the property, talking to him about the mountains and the animals and the trees as if the baby could understand every word. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winters spent cozy in the cabin, springs full of new growth and new life, summers of hard work and long golden evenings, autumns when the aspens turned and they prepared for the cold to come again. When Thomas was 3, they made another trip to Trinidad, and Willa discovered she was pregnant again. Their second child, a daughter they named Rose after Pierce's mother, was born in the cabin with only Pierce to help. He delivered his daughter with steady hands and tears streaming down his face, and when he placed the squalling infant in Willa's arms, she thought her heart might burst from happiness. Rose was different from Thomas, quieter and more observant, with her father's pale eyes and her mother's determined chin. She toddled after her brother everywhere he went, and Thomas was remarkably patient with his baby sister, showing her flowers and rocks and bugs with the seriousness of a child who has been taught that all living things deserve respect. Life was not always easy. There were illnesses and injuries, hard winters when supplies ran low, summers when drought threatened the garden. There was the time a bear got into their smokehouse and Pierce had to chase it off with gunfire. There was the spring flood that nearly destroyed the cabin and had them frantically sandbagging while the children watched from the safety of the loft. But through it all, Pierce and Willa faced everything together. They had built a life based on mutual respect and deep love, and that foundation held firm against whatever challenges came their way. When the children were older, Pierce began teaching them the skills they would need to survive in the mountains. Thomas learned to track and hunt, to read the weather and navigate by the stars. Rose learned to identify plants and tend animals, to cook over an open fire and preserve food for winter. Both children could shoot straight, ride well, and handle themselves in the wilderness with confidence. But Willa also insisted they learn to read and write and do arithmetic. She taught them from the books Pierce had collected, and on winter evenings the cabin would be filled with the sound of lessons, Thomas laboriously writing his letters and Rose reading aloud in her clear, high voice. Twice a year they would make the journey to Trinidad, trading furs for supplies and visiting with Mrs. Campbell and Emma. The town grew and changed over the years, but the two older women remained constants, always delighted to see Willa and Pierce and their growing children. It was on one of these trips, when Thomas was 12 and Rose was 9, that they encountered Mr. Hendricks on the street. He was grayer and thinner than Willa remembered, with a mean, pinched look about his mouth. He saw them and started to cross the street to avoid them, but Pierce called out to him, "Hendricks, a word." The older man stopped, clearly not wanting a confrontation but unable to refuse. Pierce walked up to him, and though he did not touch him or threaten him, Something in his posture made Hendricks shrink back. "I want you to know," Pierce said quietly, "that the woman you tried to ruin is now my wife. She is the mother of my children and the finest person I have ever known. And every day I thank God that she had the courage to stand up to you, because if she had not, I would never have met her." Hendricks's face flushed red. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." "I am sure you do," Pierce said, "but it does not matter now. You are a small, bitter man, and you will die alone and forgotten. But Willa and I have a life full of love and joy, and our children will carry that forward into the world. So really, you did us a favor." He turned and walked back to where Willa stood with the children, leaving Hendricks sputtering on the sidewalk. Willa took his hand and squeezed it, loving him even more for defending her honor while also showing the kind of measured restraint that came from genuine strength. That night, as they lay in bed at the boarding house, Willa thought about how different her life had turned out from what she had imagined. If someone had told her, that night in the alley when Pierce had first appeared from the shadows, that she would end up married to a mountain man with 2 children and a life she loved beyond measure, she would not have believed them. "What are you thinking about?" Pierce asked, pulling her close. "How lucky I am," she said. "How lucky we are." "I am the lucky one," he said, kissing her forehead. "You gave up everything to be with me." "I did not give up anything that mattered," Willa said. "I traded a life I was enduring for a life I love. That is not sacrifice, Pierce. That is wisdom." He chuckled, his chest rumbling under her cheek. "When did you get so smart?" "I have always been smart," she teased. "You are just now noticing." They lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the town settling for the night, and Willa felt the same sense of contentment that had filled her since the day she had first seen Pierce's cabin. This was where she belonged, with this man and their children, building a life in the mountains. More years passed, and the children grew. Thomas turned into a tall, strong young man with his father's quiet competence and his mother's quick mind. Rose became a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's steel. They were both products of the mountains, as much a part of that wild landscape as the pines and the peaks. When Thomas was 18, a trapper passing through their area brought word that his services were needed at a ranch down in the valley. The rancher was looking for someone who knew the mountains and could guide a herd through a difficult pass. Thomas went, and when he came back 2 months later, he brought with him a shy, pretty girl named Mary who had been working as a cook at the ranch. "This is the woman I am going to marry," Thomas announced, and though Willa felt the bittersweet pang of knowing her son was becoming his own man, she welcomed Mary with open arms. They were married that fall, and Pierce helped Thomas build a cabin a mile downstream from their own. Mary proved to be a good match for Thomas, steady and capable, and Willa was delighted when, a year later, she became a grandmother for the first time. Rose, meanwhile, showed no interest in settling down. She loved the mountains with a fierce passion, and would spend weeks at a time exploring the high country, mapping streams and sketching wildflowers, and generally worrying her parents with her independence. But she always came home safe, and eventually they stopped trying to tame her and simply accepted that their daughter had inherited her father's need for wildness. Pierce and Willa grew older together, their hair turning gray and their faces marking with lines earned from sun and laughter. But their love for each other only deepened with time, tempered by years of shared experiences and tested by challenges overcome together. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Pierce took Willa back to the meadow where he had first kissed her. The aspens were gold again, just as they had been that day, and the stream sang the same song it had always sung. "I would do it all again," he said, taking her hands. "Every moment, every choice, every hardship, It was all worth it to have you by my side." "I would too," Willa said, tears in her eyes. "You saved me that night in the alley, Pierce. But more than that, you gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," he said, and kissed her as the golden leaves fell around them like benediction. More years rolled by, bringing new grandchildren and new joys. Thomas and Mary had 4 children in all, and they would come to visit their grandparents in the summer, filling the cabin with noise and laughter. Rose eventually met a geologist who came to study the mountains, and married him in a simple ceremony beside the stream. They built their own cabin nearby and raised 2 children who were as wild and free as their mother had been. Pierce and Willa watched their family grow and flourish, their mountain home becoming the heart of a small community bound by blood and choice. And though they faced losses and sorrows, the death of Mrs. Campbell, the harsh winter that took 3 of their chickens, the illness that nearly claimed Rose's youngest, they faced them together, their bond unbreakable. On a spring morning in 1910, when Willa was 62 and Pierce was 65, they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sun rise over the mountains. They had been married for 32 years, and every day had been a gift. "You ever regret it?" Willa asked, not for the first time. "Staying in Trinidad all those weeks instead of going back to the mountains right away. Letting yourself fall in love with a jobless seamstress." Pierce looked at her, his pale eyes still sharp despite his age, and gave her the same answer he always gave. "The only thing I regret is not meeting you sooner. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Willa Northwood, best thing by far." She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together in the peaceful silence of the mountains they had made their home. Behind them, the cabin they had filled with love and laughter stood solid and strong. Around them, the mountains rose eternal and beautiful, and before them, whatever years remained stretched full of promise. Their grandchildren would tell their own children about the mountain man who had appeared from the shadows to save a young woman in trouble, and about the love that had grown from that chance encounter. They would tell about the cabin in the high country where 2 people had built a life based on respect and trust and deep, abiding love. They would tell about the courage it took to choose an unconventional path and the rewards that came from following your heart. But for now, in this moment, it was just Pierce and Willa, together as they had been for 3 decades, watching the sun paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, and they sat in perfect contentment, 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful in the wilderness. The stream rushed past, eternal and unchanging. The aspens whispered in the breeze, and in the cabin behind them, the life they had made together stood as testament to the truth that sometimes the best things come from the moments when we need help most, and from the courage to accept that help from unexpected sources. Pierce pressed a kiss to Willa's silver hair, and she squeezed his weathered hand, and they remained there as the sun climbed higher, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their love story and would stand long after they were gone, a monument to the wild beauty of the land and the enduring power of love. As the morning wore on and the sun warmed the meadow, their daughter Rose arrived with her 2 children in tow, bringing fresh bread and news from down the valley. Soon after, Thomas and Mary came with their youngest grandson, a bright-eyed boy of 5 who wanted his grandfather to show him how to track deer. The cabin filled with family, with voices and laughter, and the comfortable chaos of people who loved each other. Willa moved through it all with quiet joy, pouring coffee and cutting bread and settling disputes between grandchildren with the wisdom of long experience. Pierce showed little Samuel how to read the tracks in the soft earth by the stream, his patience with the child as infinite as it had been with his own children decades before. And as the day unfolded, full of ordinary moments that became precious simply because they were shared, Willa looked around at everything she and Pierce had built, not just the cabin and the barns and the gardens, but this family, this legacy of love, and knew that every hard choice, every moment of fear or doubt, had been worth it. That night, after everyone had gone home and the cabin was quiet again, Pierce and Willa prepared for bed. They moved around each other with the choreographed ease of people who had shared the same space for 3 decades, anticipating needs and avoiding collisions without thought. "It was a good day," Pierce said as they settled under the quilts Willa had made over the years, each one a story of a different season. "Every day with you is a good day," Willa said, and though it was sentimental, it was also true. He pulled her close, and she rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and somewhere in the distance a coyote sang to the moon. These were the sounds that had filled their nights for 32 years, the wilderness symphony that had become as familiar as breathing. "I love you, Willa Northwood," Pierce murmured into the darkness. "I love you too, Pierce Northwood," she whispered back. "Always have, always will." They drifted off to sleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The mountains stood guard around them, ancient and eternal, and the stars wheeled overhead in their timeless dance. In Trinidad, the town that had brought them together continued its own march through time, growing and changing with the new century. The Silver Spur Saloon still stood, though under new management. The Homestead restaurant had been taken over by Emma's daughter when Emma retired. Mrs. Campbell had been buried in the town cemetery 5 years earlier, her grave tended faithfully by those who remembered her kindness. But up in the mountains, in a meadow beside a rushing stream, the story that had started with a drunk man and a dark alley, and a mountain man appearing from shadows, continued to unfold. It was a story of courage and love, of choosing the harder path because it led to something true, of building a life on trust and respect and unwavering devotion. It was a story that would be told and retold, passed down through generations, changing slightly with each telling but always maintaining its essential truth. That love can appear when you least expect it, in the form of a stranger who steps between you and danger, and that if you are brave enough to accept it, that love can transform everything. Pierce and Willa lived many more years together in their mountain home, growing old with grace and dignity, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved deeply. And when, many years later, they finally left this world within months of each other, their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren laid them to rest in the meadow they had loved, beneath the aspens that turned gold every autumn, and the mountains that had sheltered their love. Their cabin stood for generations after, maintained by their descendants as a reminder of what they had built. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines, and the stream sang its eternal song, people said you could sometimes feel their presence there. Two souls who had found each other in the wild places and had made those wild places home. The legacy of that night in Trinidad, when a drunk man tried to pull a frightened woman into an alley, and a mountain man appeared from the shadows and stood between them, lived on in every child born to their line, in every act of courage and kindness, in every choice to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. It lived on in the stories told around campfires and dinner tables, in the lessons passed from parent to child about the importance of protecting those who needed protection, and the power of choosing love over fear. And somewhere in the high country of Colorado, where the aspens still turn gold and the streams still rush cold and clear, where the mountains stand eternal against the sky, the spirit of that love endures. It endures in the wild beauty of the land, in the strength of the trees and the persistence of the wildflowers, in every sunrise that paints the peaks in shades of rose and gold. Pierce and Willa's story became the foundation upon which their descendants built their own lives, a touchstone to return to when times were hard or choices were difficult. It reminded them that sometimes the best things in life come from unexpected sources, that courage can look like accepting help when you need it, and that love, real love, is worth any sacrifice and overcomes any obstacle. Their grandson Samuel, who had learned to track deer at his grandfather's knee, eventually became a ranger in the newly formed national parks, dedicating his life to protecting the wilderness his grandparents had loved. He married a woman who shared his passion for the mountains, and together they raised children who understood that some things, the wild places, the clean water, the untouched forests, were worth preserving for future generations. Their granddaughter Alice, Rose's eldest, became a botanist who studied the wildflowers of the high country, cataloging species and fighting to protect the fragile alpine ecosystems. She never married, choosing instead to devote herself to her work, but she always said that she had learned from her grandmother Willa that a woman could choose her own path and find happiness in unexpected places. Each grandchild and great-grandchild carried forward some piece of Pierce and Willa's legacy, whether it was their love of the mountains, their commitment to family, their willingness to work hard for what they wanted, or their understanding that true strength came from gentleness, and that real courage meant standing up for those who could not stand up for themselves. And so the years became decades, and the decades became a century, and still the story endured. The story of the drunk man and the alley and the mountain man who appeared from shadows and changed everything. The story of Willa, who had lost everything and found the courage to start again. The story of Pierce, who had thought he was content alone until he learned what it meant to share his life with someone who understood him. It was a love story, pure and simple, but it was also so much more than that. It was a story about transformation and redemption, about finding home in unexpected places, about building something lasting in a world that constantly changed. It was about the power of one choice, one moment, one act of courage to alter the course of a life. In the end, that is what their descendants remembered most. Not the hardships or the struggles, not the long winters or the difficult times, but the love that had sustained Pierce and Willa through everything. The love that had started with a simple act of protection and had grown into something that shaped lives for generations. And when the great-great-grandchildren of Pierce and Willa told the story to their own children, sitting around fires in the same meadow where their ancestors had built their cabin, they always ended it the same way, with the reminder that love, real love, is worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for, worth building a life around. And that sometimes, when you need it most, help comes from the shadows in the form of someone who will stand between you and danger, who will protect you and cherish you and love you for exactly who you are. The mountains still stand, eternal and beautiful, watching over the meadow where Pierce and Willa made their home. The stream still rushes past, singing its endless song. The aspens still turn gold every autumn, and the wildflowers still carpet the ground every spring. And in the hearts of all who came after, the love story that began in a dusty street in Trinidad, Colorado, in the summer of 1878 continues to live on, a testament to the enduring power of love and the transformative magic of finding the person who makes you whole. Pierce and Willa's story was complete, their lives fully lived, their love fully realized. They had started with nothing but hope and courage, and had built an empire of the heart that would endure long after they were gone. They had loved deeply and well, had raised good children who raised good children of their own, had protected the land they loved and the values they cherished. And in the quiet moments, when the wind whispers through the high country and the stars shine bright overhead, their descendants can still feel their presence, still hear the echo of their laughter, still sense the strength of the bond that held them together through 3 decades of marriage and every challenge life threw at them. This is how love endures, not just in memory but in legacy, not just in stories but in the lives shaped by those stories. Not just in the past, but in every present moment when someone chooses courage over fear, when someone stands up for what is right, when someone opens their heart to love despite the risk. Pierce Northwood appeared from the shadows that night in Trinidad and stood between Willa Olsen and danger, and in that moment, everything changed. 2 lives that had been separate became intertwined. 2 hearts that had been lonely found completion. And a love story began that would echo through the generations, inspiring and uplifting and reminding everyone who heard it that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, and that the courage to accept those gifts can change everything. Their story was complete, their ending happy, their legacy assured. And in the high country of Colorado, where the mountains touch the sky and the wilderness still runs free, the spirit of their love endures, as permanent and unchanging as the peaks themselves, a monument to the truth that love, real love, conquers all.